Alrighty, welcome everyone back to another Conformance Friday on AU Patient Summary. This one's for the 18th of July 2025. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today, and that we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators, and healers. So, just coming to sort of a wrap up point, what the journey that we have been on is going through some of the background right from a fire conformance sort of 101 and to really look at what does conformance mean for an Australian patient summary, and what does it mean, especially in the context that we want to conform to both AU Core and we want to conform to the International Patient Summary. So we have been aiming to prepare a proposal of conformance requirements that we would then put out to the community as part of the draft for comment that's going to be coming out in August. And these sessions were to develop those and then take them through the fortnightly calls, the AU Patient Summary Fire IG calls, for further discussion and voting as part of the project team on agreeing and or making any amendments for what will go in. And we also look to identify and propose any sort of changes to AU Core and to IPS to help us do that. And we're basically at the end of that initial point. So going to our patient summary conformance sessions page. So this is kind of the master page, master index of everything we've been working through. It's had all the links, it's had the conformance proposal, it's got a record of all our sessions we've had, all the PowerPoints, also got transcripts, chat log, and some notes out of those sessions are here. So over the last month, we have successfully taken through, with some minor amendments, and I'll show what those are today, through the AU Patient Summary Fire IG calls, a baseline kind of conformance profile for AU Patient Summary. So this session is kind of pre-ballot to walk through what that looks like for this group and if there are any refinements on wording we want to make. This isn't a voting and approval group, so we can't say things like, oh, that has to be a shall. I mean, you can say it, but we can't make that decision. The agreement on what is going to go into the ballot draft has been made. So that kind of thing would be what we would say, look, if you feel strongly that a should be a may, or something should be stronger, or we're missing something, that's the kind of content we're looking for in the ballot for comment. We know we can't address everything prior to it, but we've got a baseline snapshot that's going to go out for comment. I know I'm going to throw a few things in the mix because I think there's some things that we could be clearer on, or maybe some finer grained things we just haven't had time to consider. So that's really what we're looking at today, is where did we get to? What does it all look like now? And do we have any further kind of improvements in wording so that the intent of what we're saying is clear to the community in that draft? While theoretically, there is kind of if we keep these on the fortnightly, there's this session on the 1st of August. I would like to propose cancelling that. I think at this point, after today's session, I don't think there's any reason that we need to hold this. So I intend to cancel the next fortnight one, unless there's anything that people feel strongly about thinking that we need it, or that there's something to talk about in that session. And not hearing anything, I'm going to send out a cancellation for that meeting. The one after, which is in the ballot period, I think is a penciled in cancellation. If, for example, the first couple of weeks of ballot, we get a lot of feedback around conformance, I'd like to still hold that meeting and have a discussion on what that is in order to prepare some responses and really consider that kind of feedback in this meeting. But if that hasn't happened, I will send out a cancellation for this meeting. And that would mean that the next session would be this one, which is where we will start to look at the ballot feedback that is coming in, both from people within Australia, but also there are IPS SMEs who will be reviewing the AU patient summary, and they might have some feedback on some of our choices that we need to go through and consider. So I think we'll definitely hold this meeting, but I expect the next kind of couple to actually be cancelled. So today, I'm just going to really run you through the IG. What does it look like? What have we actually achieved? What is going to go out for ballot for comment? Some of this is a little bit of a in progress kind of pages. It hasn't gone through editorial review or QA review yet. That will happen, but let's have a look at it, and let's have a look particularly at some of the conformance wording to put that in front of eyes here and see if there are any tweaks we think we want to make. So that's what today's meeting is going to be about. You can also at any point pop your hand up and ask questions. This is informal sort of meeting. While we won't vote particularly or make decisions, besides maybe clarifying some wording. If there's anything that you have a question about or you want to go into more, still around like patient summary and conformance or IPS and how that relates, then yeah, please feel free to put your hand up at any time and we'll go through that. So I'm actually going to take a step back. This is our CI build. So this is the latest draft that is usually somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour behind the latest commit, because that's how long it takes to build on this site. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment with a whole bunch of agreements that are coming through and some of the base editorial kind of work. So coming through our IG, we have a conformance tab. This is where essentially you start from looking at conformance. There's two pages here. There's a general requirements page, which is what we've really been working through. And there's a declaring conformance page. So the general requirements page has all of the statements we've been making around suppressed data and no known X and what empty sections look like. Whereas the declaring conformance page is more informative. So what this really is talking about how servers that implement AU patient summary can declare that they do that. This is pretty much the same as what's in AU Core and IPA and so forth for how to do this. It's just got some examples. So for those of you who were like, what is this? What is this page? That's what this page is. So let's go back to general requirements. So what you'll note, this first one coming off, systems claiming conformance to AU patient summary will represent digital health information using the content models of the profiles and, this is an and, implement the requirements of one or both actors. This is where we've been going through a lot of our work on, did we want a profile or a data only approach? And we said no, that there's always behaviors relating to this, that it doesn't make sense to talk about this without having actors. And so we're being really clear up front that it's not just I implement one profile, it is that I'm actually implementing the profiles and the actors. I know the actors actually say that. The actors talk about the profile, but this is kind of the launching point for people coming into AU patient summary. And I'm just going to run through this page for people. This next paragraph is the same in every kind of HL7A UIG, an international one that just warns people that the requirements of the fire standard apply and the fire conformance rules. And so we talk about saying, hey, we have shall and shall not, and should not, and may. We also then, and again, this is a standard section, try to identify the requirements documented in other specifications, typically fire, though in this case also IPS, that are relevant to implementers who are trying to conform to AU patient summary. So what's called out in particular is that IPS has a generation and data inclusion section and a narrative and language translation. We don't say anything in particular about these items in our AU patient summary. And then there's things around just fire terminology, fire documents, because AU patient summary is a document. There's a link here to fire clinical documents, which is the international IG for clinical documents for fire. And we talk about RESTful APIs and search and resource formats and data types. So that's just pretty standard stuff. The next section is talking about the conformance artifacts that are published in this IG. And we've got two kinds. We've got profiles and extensions here, and we've got actors. What we don't have, of course, are capability statements, and we don't have any things like search operations. And we also don't define any value sets or any code systems here. We are binding to pre-existing terminology, either IPS, the fire standard, or it's coming through from AU cause binding that we're inheriting because that's where the localization from AU CDI and all the local clinical reference work and the peak body work has happened. And that just again makes clear that this is really what the profiles do and that the actors list these and there are obligations in each profile on what you need to do here. There's a section on mandatory elements. And this describes that mandatory elements are elements with a minimum cardinality of greater than 0. I'm just going to pause here and let people read this section. Does this make sense to you, this section, with these 3 paragraphs? Or are there any improvements that you think we should make before putting this out to community review in the ballot for comment? For those people who can't just somehow see, which makes sense, where that goes to our missing and must support section that we agreed here, where we've got the missing data here. That's where that link goes. Does anyone need more time? Or will I move on from this section?
I just wonder whether or not there is a need to mention must support here, given that this is just about the mandatory nature of the data element.
Well, I think there is a difference. Well, sort of. There
Well, there are
can be a
differences between the
difference.
two.
Yeah. I think because not all mandatory elements. Well, hang on. So the convention here is to do this, but I guess people might, if they implement an optional a backbone element find themselves with a mandatory element they don't have data for, but it's not marked as must support. So I think there is a difference.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that this section is about mandatory elements and why
Yes.
introduce must support, which is sort of like orthogonal to the concept of mandatory.
This has come out of feedback in a few places. And Marika, you just went off mute. So if you want to
I was
say
going to say,
something.
flip side, I think it's important to include both. Could we just update the heading?
Well, we already have a must support and mandatory data. So what are you thinking with this section?
Just thinking with the heading, if we go like must support and mandatory elements.
I think it would have to be mandatory elements and must support mandatory elements.
Which would be totally fine. Would that get around what your concern is, Stephen, around the discongruence between the heading and the paragraph?
Well, somewhat. The reason why I am a bit hesitant about introducing the concept of or inclusion of the concept must support in a mandatory element section is that the two concepts can go together, but they don't necessarily need to go together. So why complicate sort of a section that specifically mentioned about it's about mandatory elements with the concept of must support. In particularly, there is my expectation there is somewhere in this implementation guide a subsections about must support or some.
Yeah, so the feedback, the reason we mention it here is the feedback in other specs, and IPA has had this as well in US core, that people were like, but there are must support requirements when it's mandatory and must support. But I didn't know that when I read this section. So please mention it here so I can go link to it. So that's why that has ended up being in the HL7A UIGs, and I think also linked into things like IPA. We've certainly gotten that feedback on AU Core that we didn't used to have this, but we put it in because of a request from the community that they felt like, because this is far down, like, I mean, it's not that far down, but it is down here in the missing data section, that people wanted to have a link to it in this mandatory elements. Because I agree that they're orthogonal, but they do go together.
Well, anyway, look, let's not sort of like get too fixated on semantic theories. I still don't think that is necessary, but I think if the general consensus is that it's useful to have it in here, then yeah, I rest my case.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll test this. We'll take it out. I mean, it's in there based on a previous request in a couple of other IGs. So we've popped this one in. I don't mind either way, to be honest. It's about, yeah, exactly, what makes it easier to read for people. It doesn't change the requirements. All right, at this point, before I get into this section, I'm actually going to pop up to the actors because we have to implement the profiles and the actors. And in terms of the actors, we have two. We have two actors. We've got consumer and producer. And these consumer and producer also then reference back to that page in the sections we were about to get to. And here's what we've got for them. So what I'll do is I'll run through the consumer requirements and then I'll go back to that page. And here is essentially the agreed requirements with this sort of a roughly agreed wording, which we'll tweak through ballot, but also maybe this session. So we've got that an AU PS consumer is a system that consumes, noting that was accepted. I know that was a topic in this group where we had a lot of discussion around what is the word we use here, and we agreed no, consumes is what we want. and that was accepted in the patient summary for IG call. So it's a system that consumes an AU PS bundle, and it uses it to display or process patient summary content. And this actor is based on the Consumer IPS Actor, and it describes the additional requirements and documentation applied for the Australian context. Then we go into the details of it. Now, some of this display is changing. There's a number of requests on IG Publisher changes to, instead of using the computable name here, to like have the title that are being worked through. But for now, this kind of content is auto-generated, by the way, folks. I don't do this. I supply the text, and then what shows on this page is an auto-formatted set of content that does have all the right information. It's just maybe not as pretty and as easy to understand as we would like. So that's being worked through in the background and will in a future date show up. It might show up before ballot. It might be later. But the requirements, so here's what we've got, that AU patient summary consumer shall comply with the requirements of the IPS consumer, because we are essentially the localization of this content. So that links off to the IPS consumer. And this is where we call out our specifics. I know we state an end here. In truth, a lot of these points are actually the requirements of an IPS consumer, but IPS has declined at this time to have a narrative summary and has left the majority of this to the obligations. So if an implementer had read all of the profiles and thought it through, they would know what some of these are, but we have just taken the approach, especially for community feedback, to put what we hope is a readable summary of these requirements. And here's what we agreed to, that an IPS consumer shall implement the AUPS bundle, composition, and AUPS patient profiles, because they are the minimum, always, for a consumer. We have said that they shall, for each mandatory section in the composition, implement the profiles referenced by the section entry. We've got an IE here because this is the complete list of profiles. It's AUPS allergy intolerance, it's AUPS condition, and it's, oh, that should be an or. Douchey, can you send me an email or raise a GitHub or something, or just fix it? Oh, you know what? I can do that now. While we're here, I have this open. If I can get out of this display, let's fix it while we're here. Let me open up the actor definitions because I do not want to lose that. Resources, consumer. Okay, that is here. Let's change that to all. Perfect. Okay, back to this. So, because that's a choice, a consumer, oh, actually I'm wrong. Sorry, I was stuck on the producer. It's the producer that it's optional for. A consumer has to be capable of doing both medication statement and medication request. My apologies, let me undo that. I'll just check because I'm not sure if I'm seeing any hands up. Okay, so that's the requirement that consumers or a system that declares that it can consume AU patient summary documents needs to be capable of consuming AU patient summaries that have allergy intolerance, that have condition, that have medication statement, and that have medication request. A producing system might have only done medication request. A different one might have only done medication statement. Some systems might have done a mix, but the consuming system, if it says I can handle AU patient summary documents, needs to be capable of consuming both. Then we've got the shoulds. So should for each recommended section, implement the profiles, me just I've got a Zoom thingy in the way. Implement the profiles referenced by the section. So this is a should. That's things like immunization. That's things like observation results, radiology, IPS. Some of the profiles referenced are IPS profiles and not AU PS profiles. We've just listed a few examples there. So that's why this is an EG. Then we've got shall implement the consumer obligations in the implemented profiles. So for whatever you're implementing, there are consumer obligations, and you have to implement those obligations to declare yourself a conformant kind of consuming system. Sometimes it's an IPS profile referenced, not an AUPS profile, and in that case, it's the IPS consumer, which is titled this, so consumer in brackets IPS, whose obligations that you have to be meeting. And then we've got, last of all, here's our reference out to this kind of content, that they shall consume resources with must support elements that have been populated in accordance to the requirements for missing data, empty sections, known absence of data, or suppressed data. And we've got links back to that section on that. I'm actually relatively happy with this wording. I think that's enough to express our intent to the community. But while I was walking through that, did anyone spot anything that they think we should be tweaking before we put it out for the ballot for comment?
Not for me.
Yep. Okay. I will pop to the producer. This one's I've got a few more words, so let's just run through it and make sure that we think that this is clear, or at least clear enough for the community to understand it and provide feedback. So we've got an AUPS producer, and we're saying this is a system which creates or assembles an AUPS bundle, because the bundle is the FIRE document, through automated generation or human curation of the patient summary content. And again, this actor is based on the producer IPS actor. Now, I need to make a change here. IPS has just agreed to change their name for this actor. It's now creator. I fixed it here, but I did not fix it there. So let me just go to that. Here. And we describe the additional requirements and documentation.
Sorry, Danielle, will you also update that in the canonical URL?
No. Well, I have here. That's IPS's canonical URL. So we're not changing our one. We're changing just IPS just changed their, well, they did change their, yeah, there.
Okay.
We're still going to be producer. IPS changed to creator. In preference for a number of jurisdictions, implementation tying really closely to IHE. Producer is more closely aligned to FIRE, and we might see if any comments come out through the ballot, but I don't think we can't make that kind of decision in this sort of meeting to change the nature of the actor and its title.
Thanks for clarifying.
No worries. So we've got that an AUPS producer shall comply with the requirements of the IPS actor, which is now titled Creator IPS and was until, very recently titled Producer. And here's our requirements. Again, a lot of these are the actual IPS requirements. Almost all of them are the actual IPS requirements, but for a whole number of reasons for ease of implementation, we have pulled these out into a summary to provide what is hopefully a sort of succinct list for implementers with some links off to things to give this overall sort of overview of what these requirements are. So we say they shall implement the AUPS bundle, composition and patient profiles. Matches, of course, the consuming one, because again, they are the mandatory profiles that really have to be done. Then we've got shall for each mandatory section in the composition implement the AUPS profiles referenced by the corresponding section entry. This is where we see what I was talking about, that this is allergy intolerance, this is condition, and for producer, it's at least one of medication statement and medication request. You can do both, but you've got to do at least one. For the recommended sections here, we've got a should. So we implement the profiles referenced by the corresponding section entry. That's should. Again, that matches the obligations. The obligations are consistent for producers for every section. So we've just summarized it here. And we've listed some examples of what those profiles are. There are more. It's the same examples for consumers. We then go on to optional and undefined sections. We say should for each optional and undefined section. Implement profiles referenced in the bundle. Otherwise, implement an AU core or AU-based profile where applicable. I'm going to have some feedback on this. I think this needs to be clarified. There's a should obligation on populate if known for the section entries for recommended sections, but it's actually a may for optional and undefined section. And I think this is a bit misleading. So while we can't change conformance verbs in this meeting, I think this needs to be clarified, and I'm going to provide some comments through the ballot that we can clarify what we mean here, because this seems to mix conforming to a profile if you've implemented a resource with bundling it up with, or you actually have to implement the resource. And so I think we need to find a way to sort of split that you may implement the section entry, and if you do, you should implement the profile or something like that. The next one is, of course, shall implement the obligations defined in the profile. So for the profiles you're implementing, you shall implement the obligations defined. And again, when it's an IPS one, you implement, look, that says producer. I need to go change that again. Here it is. Yep, creator. So you shall implement the creator IPS actor. And then we've got the last bits that you shall implement the requirements on suppressed data when, oh, I love that grammar. I think we can just get rid of that. Data is not allowed to be shared. And then shall implement the requirements on missing data, empty sections, known absence of data. So that's our summary of requirements, noting I made a couple of quick fixes as I was talking through it. Has anyone spotted anything else? Does anyone have any questions about this? All right, we can pop back to it at any time. I'm now going to go back to where we were, which is around the missing data, the empty sections, and the known absence of data. So coming across here, we just finished the mandatory elements, which is the section above this. And then we went and had a look at the actors, and that ties us into this content here. So I have had a go at trying to provide some clarity based on what we've been talking around the circumstances of when we would use things. I've had a look through the fire standard for the language that's used, and I've trawled back through our transcripts and our recording on how we've been phrasing what these kind of different circumstances are. So this is my current best attempt at it, to talk about differentiation between these and why we have these 4 sections, which have been approved through the AU PS Fire IG group project team to go out for ballot for comment around things like empty sections or like no known X or workflow or missing data. And here's what I've got. A lot of this is drawn heavily from the fire standard that has guidance on no known X, no history of X, and also missing data, and also workflow. So I've said it's important to differentiate between affirmatively stating a patient has no known X or no history of X. I've given an example. For example, that a patient has no known allergies, versus not having data in the record for a particular section. For example, where a source system does not have information on a patient's allergies, versus asserting that this data is not available due to a workflow reason. For example, allergies were not reviewed and are unknown, versus not having data for a particular element. For example, the onset date of a particular allergy is not available in the system, and the system doesn't know the reason for the absence. And they're kind of the 4 things to try to lead us into, in the above circumstances, the following is applied. So we say where the data is missing for an element within a resource and the reason isn't known, you shall implement the requirements of the missing data section. Where it's missing for a section and the reason isn't known, you shall implement the requirements of the empty sections section. Where it's not available due to a workflow reason, you should implement the requirements of known absence of data due to workflow. And when stating no known X or no history of X, you should implement the guidance of the no known X section. How is that working for people? Should we go into detail in the sections? Let's start with missing data. So this is where data is missing for an element and the reason isn't known, which ties into this example here around onset date of a particular allergy. We've got missing must support and optional, missing must support and mandatory. So we've got these requirements. If you don't know the value for an optional element, and then you shall omit it from the resource. Basically, there's a few words there. And if it's mandatory, which is minimum cardinality greater than 0, then it shall be present even if you don't know the value. And in this circumstance, the requirements defined by AU Core shall be applied. I did put in an example here of what that looks like, both using the extension and not using the extension. I am tentative on having the example there. We could just totally leave it to people to click off to AU Core, which does have examples of what this content looks like. But I did put an example in anyway, in line. I'm not particularly attached to it. Are there any suggested tweaks to this wording? And also, are people thinking that, no, we shouldn't have the example here, just point off to AU Core and that's sufficient?
Personally, I like the example being in there. I remember trying to understand this the first time and it being fairly confusing. So I think in this case, not having to jump to another specification is a good idea.
All right, let's leave it in for now. We'll see if anyone complains about it during ballot. All right, that's the current wording. It's very similar to the wording for AU Core, except AU Core obviously doesn't refer off to itself. And again, we can revise some of this wording through the ballot for comment process. Let's go to the next bit. So scrolling down, we've got the empty sections. This hasn't changed since the last time you've seen it. So producers, this is a should omit non-mandatory sections when the source system doesn't have the information and doesn't know the reason the information is absent. And for mandatory, they shall be present. And in this case, you shall use the code unavailable from the list empty reasons code system. And then we've just really got this information warning for AU PS consumers to be aware that there can be other things sent in empty reason. It's not just empty sections. And then we've got an example of what that might look like. I'm expecting some feedback, I think, through ballot on the specifics of this. We don't need to do that today. That's what that section looks like. I'm pretty happy with the wording here, but are there any changes anyone wants? No? I'm going to pop on. So here we go, where this was a little more worked through in our last call. So this is changed to should, hence the should up above. So where the system doesn't have information for a particular section and there's a known workflow reason, for example, the patient preferred not to answer, the system should represent that reason by populating composition section empty reason. We've listed these three, which are the three that we agreed to, and so did the AU patient summary fire IG call. And then I've got the example here for this one, not asked. Any suggestions for this particular section or any questions about it? All right, let's go to the next one. This is no known X. So this is where a system can assert no known X, for example, no known conditions or no history of X. I'm looking for an example of no history of X that's coded in SNOMED and available in the ref set. Michael Osborne is looking that up. It's probably something like no history of cardiovascular disease. The system, so we've got a should here. Again, now this used to be a shall. This was a shall from our last call, and then we took that to the AU patient summary fire IG call, and the consensus that was agreed there is that this needs to be a should. So that's what we've put in, that where you can assert no known X or no history of X, you should populate composition section entry in accordance with the relevant profile specific implementation guidance. Then we've got the example related to the AUPS allergy intolerance. And then we've said this approach is preferred, because again, it's a should, it's preferred to using empty reason due to IPS, AU core, US core, and those patterns on it. And we've got an example of what that looks like here, a condition resource representing no known problems. This also matches the guidance taken out of the fire standard with that particular code. Oh, thanks, Michael. We can throw that in. This is, I think, probably one of the most, the ones that we had a lot more of discussion on the wording and trying to make this clear. Is this now clear enough to take to ballot for comment, this wording and this example? Right, so our thumbs up, that's good. All right, I'll move on past this one then. Next, we come to suppressed data. So the first time we talked about this, we made a number of changes to make this clearer and also to line up with what I think was both the preferred implementation direction for a number of people who were looking to implement this, but also to allow at this early stage a reasonable kind of set of options for what you can do. And then this also got a lot of discussion in the AU Patient Summary Fire IG call. The same requirements essentially kind of have been agreed. What we got to, though, is that this is a may. So that, I think, is the change out of the AU Patient Summary Fire IG call. Or is it? I feel like we made a change. I'd have to go back to the minutes. But either way, this content is now that change. So I've been looking at this day in and day out. So I think I'm losing at what date I made an edit. Here's what we've got. In some circumstances, specific pieces of data are hidden. Now that intro sentence has changed because it used to say maybe hidden due to privacy and security reasons, but it was agreed that that was just too qualifying, and it may be hidden, and there are a whole number of reasons for a system on why that may be hidden, and we didn't need to put that in this introductory sentence and maybe unintentionally exclude other reasons from that. So just in some circumstances, specific pieces of data are hidden. And then we talk about what to do with the optional section. So if an optional section is not able to be shared, it may be omitted. But if it's provided, you use the code unavailable or withheld from list empty reason. If it's mandatory and is not able to be shared, use the code unavailable or withheld, because of course you have to provide it in empty reason. If it's an optional element, it shall be omitted. And if it's a mandatory element, then you use the code unknown or masked. Now, these two are lifted directly out of AU Core, but they're reformatted to work with the complexities of patient summary that brings in the sections. And then we have an example here, just one example that shows, obviously in this circumstance, it's using the withheld code. So is this good enough now in the way that we've formatted this to communicate our intention to the community? All right, got another thumbs up. I got nobody speaking or thumbs downs. I'm not actually sure you can do a thumbs down. So that's the majority, I think, of what we have spent our time on. Then we get to some informative content. I'm going to take you through it. From this point onwards, this is pretty much the informative. This section now must support an obligation is trying to provide some support for implementers in reading these profiles and looking at these obligations and these must support flags and going, what does it mean though? What does it mean, especially if I look at something like, let's just pick composition. It's got lots of options. So if we look at composition and we look at something like this, author, lots of choices. There's one must support here and there are obligations. So unsurprisingly, people are going, yes, but what does it mean? What does it mean? Do I have to do something about every single one of these or not? So we've got an informative section here that starts to go through this content. This is borrowing very heavily from the work in AU Core, which borrowed very heavily from US Core. And it's also borrowing on the work where IPS has made some clarifications, a lot of which they don't have a detailed must support section on. I'd love to see them do that. They don't have time, I think, in IPS 2.0 to do, but I do think it's something they should consider doing in the next release. So we start off with just saying, look, must support means that you shall provide support in some way, and that it's up to this specification to declare what that means. And we do this through the use of obligation codes and clarify through this section and profile specific implementation guidance. This is a list of all the obligations that are applied on at least one element in this specification. Not all elements have all of these obligations, but this will show up somewhere. There's only 2 for consumer, and they show up, to be honest, these show up, shall handle, should display on every element. There's a consumer obligation on it. Oh, look, I noticed that again. AU PS producer. Oh, no, that's correct. That's ours. AU PS producer has quite a wide variety of different kinds of obligations. These definitions are lifted straight from the fire terminology. These are all managed through a code system, these codes, and in most cases, this text here is a straight lift from there, but we do also have a few notes here to try to provide anything that we think is relevant. So as we go on and people ask questions, we can expand some of this notes section as we work out what are the kinds of common questions that people have to make these kinds of things more readable. Then we've just got this legend. How do you know something is must support an obligation? So we've got this to explain to people, where do you see it? This has been changing, IG Publisher. So I'll need to redo that diagram, I think, before we publish for ballot for comment. And then we come into the interpretation, which is meant to clarify this kind of thing, this kind of question. And so we talk about a few things. Composition sections are really different. I'm going to skip past that. And let's talk about things like primitive elements, complex elements. This is a summary of the obligation available on all of them. When we get to choices, so here, for example, this is resource references. And we've got this first one, composition author. Producers shall correctly populate the element with at least one. You don't have to populate the element with all of them, even if you know more than one. But you shall populate with at least one if the value is known. And consumers have to be capable of consuming all of them, because a producer might pick any one of those. They're all legal. So again, this lens from the AU core interpretation. That's what's proposed. What comes in a little bit here that we need to be careful. So that's shall populate if known, but some elements are shall populate, and that brings in the capability. So it's not just a populated if you know it, and we've clarified that we mean populate with at least one if you know it. You don't have to populate with every single thing that you know has possibly touched this data. You just have to provide at least one if you're a producer. Consumers have to handle whatever they've given as long as it's valid. But if this said shall populate, then that becomes a little bit different because it brings in the capability, the able to populate requirement. There is that somewhere down here. So we try to talk about all these things like the choice of data types, where some elements allow all sorts of things like onset, has date, time, age, period, and range. Again, producer shall correctly populate with at least one. Consumers shall consume if any valid data type is provided. But there is a qualification here, because some of these data type choices have should able to populate on them, which means that there is an additional set of obligations on here that producers should be capable of correctly populating the element. It's not a shall at this point. We inherit this from IPS. It's a should be capable of correctly populating with the data type, and then we list what those are. So this kind of thing we're going through and trying to clarify what all of this is, taking that interpretation from AU Core and ensuring it doesn't conflict with IPS. And then we're going to try to list all of those. This is still a work in progress to try to go through and make sure that all matches up. But when we put it out for ballot for comment, this will be there to read through. It's going to be especially important, I think, to address any confusions in the text or where we've got it wrong, or if there's any additional kind of must support clarifications we can provide. This is almost an FAQ section, to be honest, just worded in a fancy way. And that's what that section on interpreting profile elements labeled must support should do. But wait, there's more. So that's this page, general requirements. That's what's on it. We talk about systems conforming to patient summary. We point them off to the profiles and the actors. We've run through our actors. They point back to this page to say, hey, you've got requirements here around these things like missing data, empty sections, known absence of data, suppressed data. And then we have a section trying to clarify what all of this means. But what I haven't walked you through is the profiles. We've done a little bit here, but let's go to something like medication request. So we've got our medication request profile. There is that clarifying content that's relevant to this profile is here. And this is the same as in AU Core. So as we come down, we will see that medication and for other elements like intent, you've got obligations. That's a primitive element. That's pretty straightforward. There's only one way to do this. When it comes to choice elements, which are signified with a square bracket X on the end, there's more than one way. This has codable concept. You can also do reference to a medication. This has still shall populate if known, shall handle, should display. So we have that clarification both in the general section on what does it mean when you see a data type choice. And then we have it here. You can do one or the other, or at least I should have put that here. Ugh, copy paste error. I'll pop that here because we're intending to make sure that this clarification is clear up the top on how do we have to implement it. I've got a few here. We're still working our way through all of that guidance to make sure it's on the profile itself. You can see we've got one here, which is the choice between reason code or reason reference, that producers don't have to do both. Again, that's the same as AU Core, it's the same as IPA. It is the generally agreed at the moment interpretation for this, but consumers do both elements. So you'll see that on the profile specific implementation guidance to qualify in situ what some of these things mean. So that's the reason code, reason reference. Consumers do have to do both. Producers, you only need to support one. Anything else worth talking about? No, I think that's it, which is good because I think we're at time actually. Yes, oops, apologies, I've run over. I'm going to stop sharing. That is the kind of complete view of where our conformance requirements are sitting in terms of using must support, obligation, the narrative requirements and the actors. That's how it all comes together. Okay, unless there are any other questions or comments, I might end it there for today. And thanks everyone for your time over the last few weeks, really, to put together what I think is a pretty consistent approach that is conformant to core and IPS. I think that's really good.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks, Danielle.